And once again, thank you to Ten of David for sharing this time with me. We're going to be looking at a full life-size replica of the Shroud of Turin. We're going to talk about what is the Shroud of Turin. We're also going to talk about the Shroud of Turin research project, what science says about the age of the shroud, and Scripture in the shroud, how the Scripture lines up with what you see on the shroud, and what science believes caused the image that you see on the shroud. So what is the Shroud of Turin? The Shroud of Turin is believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus, and I believe that with every fiber of my being, that this is the burial cloth of Jesus. It measures 14'3" by 3'7", which happens to equal the Jewish measurements of 8 cubits by 2 cubits. It's stained with human blood, which matches the biblical account of the crucifixion, and it is in fact the single most studied artifact in human history. Now before we go any further, I want to orient you with what you're seeing, because the image that you see of a man is very faint. It is a man that has been scourged and crucified. The dark areas that you see are blood, but you can see the hair, you can see the face, and you also see the back of the body going this way. And we'll talk about why you see that mirror image a little later on in the presentation. On the edges, you see something that looks like scorch marks down both sides. That's because in 1532, this was being stored in a church in Chambry, France, in which a fire broke out. And the fire almost took the shroud from history, but it was folded up and in a metal case, but that metal case got so hot that it's said to have melted in some areas, and you can see what looks like and is believed by some to be places where the metal case dripped through. Now because it was folded, you can also see a mirror image of that on the other end down here. Now in 1534 there were repairs done to the shroud. Those repairs are what you see right here. The Poor Clare nuns, which were in the church in Chambry, France, and they were skilled in textile repair. They put the patches on, and if you look at the patches you can see that these two line up. They're a mirror of each other because the shroud was folded. So the places that were burned badly, patches were put on. Now if you also look, it's a little bit hard to see because of the light, but you can see that that cloth is different, that cloth is different, that cloth is different along the edges. In 1534, they put a backing on the shroud because it was 1,500 years old. It had been handled a lot, and the obvious area for it to begin to weaken and tear were on the edges, so that's why you see that backing there. But it was done to reinforce the entire shroud. So we see blood stains here, we see scourge marks on the back. We'll talk further about that as we continue into the presentation. So the Shroud of Turin research project. Why did people become so interested in studying the shroud? So you see a photograph there. That is a negative image. So when you take a photograph of the shroud, what you actually see here, we would consider to be the negative, because the negative is usually what is very faint and just kind of shows an outline of what the picture is going to become. But when you take a photograph of this, the negative becomes a picture. So in 1898, Secondo Pia, he took the first photograph of the Shroud of Turin, and he said that he almost dropped the glass plate when he got the negative, because he saw the face of Jesus looking back at him. So science did become interested in that in 1898 when he showed the world what happened when he took a photograph. But they looked at it, they questioned him, and they could not explain it. They didn't have access to the shroud. So they said that that was a fraud, that he had somehow manipulated the photograph, and they wrote him off as someone who had committed a fraud to try and trick people. So in 1931, Giuseppe Henry took the second photograph of the shroud, and he took around 100 photographs of the shroud, and he got the same results. And Secondo Pia, he was pleased to see those results. He was still alive, and he saw them, and he breathed a sigh of relief when he saw them, that he came up with the same thing. So that photograph garnered more interest in the shroud, but it was very hard to get access to the shroud. The Catholic Church had custodial care of the Shroud of Turin, and they didn't show it very often. So in 1976, this particular photograph was ran through what is called a VP8 image analyzer by some naval scientists. A VP8 image analyzer was actually designed to take X-rays and separate the lights and darks and create 3D-like images. Well, they ran this photo through, I presume because they thought it looked like an X-ray. And they ran it through the VP8 image analyzer, and to their surprise, it gave true 3D-like results. You can see the hair, you can see the beard and chin, you can see the mustache, the nose, the eyebrows, everything. And the entire body gave a 3D-like dimension on the VP8 image analyzer. And they were amazed by this. They were amazed because there's not another picture, there's not another drawing, there's not another painting in the world that gives true 3D-like results when ran through the VP8 image analyzer. It is actually a one of a kind. So, in 1976, Drs. Tom Jumper and John Jackson became very interested in studying the shroud because they were present when this was ran through the VP8 image analyzer. And they got a team of 40 scientists together within about 2 months of doing this, and they formed the Shroud of Turin research project, the STURP team. And so let's go ahead and roll out the photograph, which is the negative image. And this negative image, the photograph, was taken by Barry Schwartz, who was a photographer on the Shroud of Turin research project. And you're going to see the entire front view and the results of his photograph that he took in 1978. Now, Barry Schwartz, he was a Jew, and he was asked to be on this project, this team, and he didn't want to be at first. He said, first of all, I'm a Jew. What is a Jew doing studying something that's supposed to be the burial cloth of Jesus? And his second reason for not wanting to go, he says, look, we're going to spend all this time and money getting ready to go out to Turin, Italy, and then we're going to go out there and truck all this equipment out there to study the Shroud of Turin, and we're going to find that it's a fraud. We're going to find paint, dyes, powder, something like that, and it's going to explain how the image got there. So he decided to go anyway, and he decided there were 3 reasons why God wanted him to be on this Shroud of Turin research project. And the first reason, he said, was because he was a Jew that had turned his back on his faith. And he said this returned him to his faith in God. And he said the second reason is because he was to proclaim the truth. And the truth that he's talking about proclaiming is that this indeed is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. And the third reason that he gave is because he said God always uses a Jew as the messenger. So we see that Barry has a sense of humor. So now on to the Shroud of Turin research project itself. Their primary goal was to determine what the properties were that caused this faint image of a man, and also what might have caused it. So that was their goal. So they spent 2 years from 1976 to 1978 coming up with the different tests that they would run. They were given 5 days of access to it in 1978. So they didn't waste 1 minute. They actually had all of their tests lined out how long they would take. And while some scientists were sleeping, other scientists were running tests. So they spent a full 5 days studying this with the primary purposes of determining how the image got there and what might have caused it. So after doing that, they spent an additional 3 years analyzing the data, the results of their study. And in part, their statement basically said, we don't know how that image got there. We don't know what the properties are. But what we do know is that it is the image of a man who has been scourged and crucified. It does have real human blood on it. It's stained with real human blood. And we know that there are no dyes, pigments, or anything like that that could have possibly caused the image to be on there. So part of that team was a forensic pathologist by the name of Robert J. Buckland. And he did a forensic pathology report. So basically, he did the same type of thing that he might do if this were evidence in a murder trial. He found out exactly what he could about the body. He found out everything he could about the injuries sustained to the body. And so we're going to go over part of what he found out. One, we find that Jesus was 175 pounds approximately and 5'11". So he wasn't a slight man. And as we go to the injuries, he found a ring of puncture tracks on the scalp in the shape of a wig or a crown. Not a ring like this, but in the shape of a wig that covered his entire head, which blood issued and went downward. There's also a distinct abrasion on the nose and the eye. The right cheek is swollen. And you see those blood issues from the puncture wounds on the scalp up here and all the way down to the nape of the neck back here. There's a large blood stain over the right pectoral region. And the blood flow also had water in that blood flow. And unlike the other blood flows that you see, like up here, blood shows up white in this negative image. This one is distinctly a post-mortem blood flow. So the person was dead when this blood flow occurred, and there is a puncture wound in the side in which that blood flow emitted out of, caused by a sharp penetrating object, like a spear. The left hand bears distinct puncture injury. And the projection of the blood flows could not have happened with the hands in this position, but would have had to have happened with the hands upward at about a 65-degree angle. So that blood flow that occurred down the back of the arm. Only 4 fingers are visible, so look at the fingers. You don't see thumb on either hand. And that suggests that the medial nerve was damaged, the medial nerve in here, which would have caused flexion of that thumb. So when the nails were put through the hands, they were put through at an angle to get back into the wrist. And studies have shown that if you put the nail through right here on the average weight of a male, that it's not going to hold that hand, and it's going to rip right through the hand. So the Romans must have known that, and they made it a practice to drive the nail in at an angle so that it went through the wrist. The right calf is more distinct than the left calf, indicating the left foot was probably on the top of the right foot, and that a spike was driven through both feet, a single spike driven through both feet. So it would have been similar to this with a spike driven through, and that position was maintained after rigor. So when Jesus was put into the burial cloth, rigor had already set in. His body was already stiff. You do see the blood flow from both feet right here, and you see it there with just a little bit on this side, and that's likely because one foot is raised higher than the other, and that's the top of the cloth, and this is the bottom. Series of traumatic injuries on the back caused by a whipping-like motion from the back and leaving dumbbell-shaped marks in the back with issuing blood. There is evidence on the shoulder blades of a heavy abrasion on one side, hard to see here, but we will see something later on that shows us that. Consistent with a heavy object, such as a beam resting on the shoulders that would have been caused when carrying the cross. Now, I want to go over, there's so much that we could talk about and so many scientific facts. You really get sucked in if you start studying the Shroud because there's so much information out there. Because all of this information, the hundreds of thousands of hours of studies, have been published, and you can find so much information. But I've put a few scientific facts up here that just speaks of the authenticity of where this came from. Because a lot of you may know that a lot of people believe this is a medieval forgery out of Europe, somewhere out of Europe. Well, this medieval forger was very smart if he did that. So just keep that in mind as we talk about some of these scientific facts. There's limestone dust particles found in the Shroud that are from Israel, from that area. And we know from tradition that limestone caves, the soft limestone was dug out to build burial tombs, cave tombs for the people. And the Jewish custom was to leave the body in there for a year, but Jesus only needed it for 3 days, so that the body would decompose while in that cave, and then the bones would either be moved to an ossuary or they would be moved over to the side and make room on that slab for another body. There are traces of aloe and myrrh found within the cloth, and we know the Jewish burial custom was to pack the body in burial spices. It even says so in the Gospels, as is the custom when they talk about putting the spices on there. There are soil traces found under the foot, on the knee, and on the nose. Now, the ancient Jewish burial custom was to clean the body before they buried it. However, there was one exception. If the blood continued to flow after a violent death, they were to just wrap the body in linen and bury it as is without cleaning it. So we find not only the blood flows and all of that, which is a question a lot of people have, well, wouldn't they have cleaned the body? No, not in this case. But we also find dirt that was on various places. Evidence of a wooden cross. There are oak tubules, which are microscopic splinters that were found in the blood that issued from the back of the head. The blood on the shroud preceded the image. So science showed that everywhere that you see blood, that was deposited there before you see the image of the man that appeared afterwards. And it's believed that image occurred at the point of resurrection. Widow's mites, minted in 29 AD, were on the eyes of Jesus. So we see here, this is holographic photography. It's really meant to be viewed with 3D glasses on. But one of the interesting things is that in 2005, it was determined that this two-dimensional photograph has holographic properties encoded into it. It's the only known two-dimensional photograph in the world to have holographic properties built into it. So you see the little spots right here on the eyes. Those are the widow's mites. You can actually see in this photograph too the white spots right there and there. That's where the widow's mites are. And they were only able to be seen using different techniques to pull them out. And using the holographic photography, they also pulled out something else. And we're going to watch a couple of short videos that talks about the widow's mites and also what is known as an amulet underneath the beard. So if you look right here, there is the outline of something underneath the neck. And we're going to see, when using the holographic photography, they're able to pull that out. It actually has Hebrew letters on there. So we're going to take a look from a documentary.
But once it was discovered that there were other images on the shroud, Dr. Wanger began looking closer and found that there were small coins on each eye. What significance could that possibly have? Dr. Alan Wanger, in his book, The Shroud of Turin, Adventure and Discovery, points out that not only are they there, they present distinct and profound clues as to the date and origin of the image.
Father Francis Philus was professor of theology as well as a scientist who investigated the Shroud of Turin, as well as a photographer. He was working with a group of researchers who were attempting to identify what the projections over the eyes were, thinking they might be coins. And Dr. Philus had enlargement made of the excellent photographs he had of the shroud and noticed a patterning over the right eye. On enlargement of this, he noticed that there were letters which he interpreted as U-C-A-I and something that looked like a shepherd's crook. This is typical of the lepton, or the widow's mite, struck by Pontius Pilate in the years in 29 AD to 33. We can identify the images of them, and so we can identify the particular coin and know the origin as well as the date, which both of them are that we identify are struck in 29 AD. So this dates the shroud back to the 1st century. It also localizes it to Israel, since these coins are just the widow's mites or the common penny of the time, and certainly would not circulate either outside of Israel or not very long after the reign of Tiberius Caesar, to which they were dedicated.
So now we'll take a look at what holographic photography revealed underneath the beard.
The most exciting things that we found in the hologram was under the beard, in the neck. It was known already that there was a white line, but nobody could ever say what that exactly meant and what it was. It's a solid object. It is in the form like something like an amulet that was put there. Now, after studying it for quite a while, I could figure out that there were letters on it, on top, sticking out a little bit.
Well, it turns out that information on that plaque is evident in some photographs and not in others. And the people at the Eindhoven Holographic Lab in Holland found that slight variations in the focusing distance brought that information out. So on one photograph where we have this information, it was just by pure luck that everything was right and they captured it. And what's that is suggestive of is that there is different information at different depths into this image. And Dr. Peter Soons thought he saw letters there, and he talked with a rabbi and scholar who was fluent in the Aramaic and Hebrew. And the letters are apparent, and they translated those into a meaningful phrase, which says a lot about who this might be.
Amazing. So next we're going to look at just a hologram that shows the three-dimensional aspects that are encoded in this. It's just absolutely amazing. And you can see the hair really good, the beard really good, the mustache. So it's just absolutely amazing, the information that is encoded into this photograph. It's a one-of-a-kind. So let's talk about scientific dating. So how many of y'all remember in 1988 that it was determined that this is about 700 years old? Yeah. So they sang it from the rooftops that this is a medieval fraud, it's a fake. You know, it was in all the papers. Everybody heard about it. Well, nobody really heard about why those tests came out that way. So we're going to take a quick look at what happened. One, we're looking at a highlighted area of the corner in which they took the sample from, and that is right down here. So it is adjacent to one of those areas in which the Holland backing shows through because the original material is just gone, and they sewed the backing on. So that picture right there shows there are 4 different segments that were sent off to 4 different laboratories, or 3 different laboratories. Arizona got 2, Zurich and Oxford got 1. So right here on the right is spectral photography that Barry Schwartz took. Well, spectral photography fluoresces different colors based on the chemical composition of the fabric that's being photographed. So that spectral photography showed up orange, yellowish red right there. That's the main body of the shroud. Well, if we look back at the Holland backing, which we know was put on in 1534, we see it's a deep blue-green color. Well, if we look at the area right here, it looks like it's kind of fades from that deep blue-green into the orangish yellow color. So many people tried to say why that carbon dating testing came off. They said, oh, well, you had that fire in 1532, the C14 content was changed because of that. They said over the centuries, people cried on it, they kissed it, there was a lot of bacteria on it, and it changed the results because of that. But no one had anything that science could look at and say, hey, possibly so. Let's look a little deeper into that. So there was a couple from Ohio, Sue Benford and Joe Marino. They're not scientists. Sue Benford ran a nonprofit organization. Joe Marino, he was a former Benedictine monk that had become a librarian at Ohio State University. And he had studied the shroud since 1977. but his wife didn't have a whole lot of interest in it. But then one day she saw him watching a documentary, and she saw the face of Christ. And she knew, everything within her said, that is the face of Jesus. And then she got interested in determining why those carbon dating results came up the way they did. So she went to work and she found stuff on the internet using Barry Schwartz's website, where he had photographs that he had taken in 1978 on the Shroud of Turin research project, high definition photographs of every area of the shroud, little pieces at a time, and they were all labeled where they came from. So she looked at this section right here, and there's a distinct herringbone weave throughout the shroud that was consistent with what may have been done in the 1st century. And so she looked, and she was looking at that particular section, and the herringbone weave was so consistent anywhere you looked on the shroud. But when she looked there, she said it looked off axis. So she and her husband end up writing a paper that ends up getting publicated, telling why the shroud dating came up wrong. And they're not scientists, but they said, you can see the herringbone weave is very consistent, but then you can see it seems to change axis right here, and it has a line that you can kind of see, and it goes like that. And what they said in the paper is that new cloth was introduced, likely in 1534 by the Poor Clare nuns doing repair. And it was introduced, and here's the axis of it. And if you look, that means that the new cloth mixed in with the old cloth ends up getting deeper and deeper into the sample that was used for carbon dating testing. Well, they sent off, before they wrote the paper, they sent off pictures of this to 2 textile experts and said, can you tell me about this weave? And they said, oh, well, that looks like a French reweave. Well, a French reweave is something where you take 2 different fabrics and you try and make them look like they've never been repaired. So if you take 2 fabrics and put them together, usually you're going to have the old fabric, existing fabric, new fabric, and then you'll put stitching around it and just join them together. Well, in a French reweave, you don't do that. You take the ends and unravel them from both of the fabrics, and then you wrap them together so that you end up with something like that. And that's what they said was done here. So, look at the dates. So this one on the end here has the oldest date, and look, it has what they propose to be the most amount of original fabric and least amount of the new fabric. And as you go, those dates continue to increase from 1238 to 1246 to 1326 to 1430. And so it looks plausible. But they're not scientists. They never have had the shroud in their presence. They're looking at pictures online. Scientists say this is bad science. They don't pay any attention to it. But in particular, Ray Rogers, the lead chemist on the Shroud of Turin research project, it drives him batty. He sees this, and he's not a man of God. He doesn't believe in God. He believes in science, and he believes in good science. He hates bad science. But he ends up calling his friend Barry Schwartz and says, can you believe this? They're not even scientists. You know, this is crazy. I can disprove this in 5 minutes. So he says, well, Ray, go for it. So I'm going to let you hear from Ray what he did next.
I had given up on the shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw. So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples, and I got out the shroud samples, and I went to work again.
A couple hours later, he calls me and he goes, boy, he says, I can't believe it. He says, they were right. There's cotton here. He says, there's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino had been right. In fact, he found other evidence they had missed, which proved the shroud had been repaired with cotton fibers in exactly the section where the carbon dating samples had been taken.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. I'm coming to the conclusion that it has a very good chance of being the piece of cloth that was used to bury the historic Jesus.
He writes a paper that's accepted for publication in Thermochemica Acta, January of 2005.
So Ray Rogers, he was battling cancer at the time he was doing this research. It was his last project. He died before that was published. But one of the things I don't want you to miss, he worked in the Los Alamos lab in Arizona for years. He retired from there. And he actually took a part of the carbon dating sample. So when you carbon date something, you completely burn what you use for the carbon dating testing. However, it's typical if there is enough material to hold back a section of that and hold it just in case you need to look back on it. So he contacted the lab and got access to, and before he would publish his paper in Thermochemica, he wanted to make sure that what he was seeing was right with the samples that he had, which he had tape samples where he had taken tape and labeled where he had placed them on the shroud, pulled them up, and it pulled fibers up. And that's what he did, which took him about 2 hours to review and give a call back to his friend Barry Schwartz and say, I believe they're right. So one of the things that he said is additional dating of the shroud via carbon-14 is probably not possible. And that's because the Catholic Church, in their custodial care of the shroud, they have a box which they keep it in, and they started treating it with thymol, which kills anything alive. And so he said that it probably has skewed any chance for a appropriate carbon dating testing. But scientists have done additional testing, and one of them was Ray Rogers. As a part of this thermochemical paper, he measured vanillin loss, which is a chemical test. Vanillin is something that is in linen, and it does disappear, and there is a known rate. It doesn't give you a real tight range, but he determined that it was between 1,300 and 3,000 years old, the cloth was. There are two spectroscopy tests that were done, one infrared and one Raman spectroscopy, and they came up with dates between 1,600 and 2,300 years old and 1,500 and 2,200 years old. So all these date ranges fall right within what they need to be for it to be a first century cloth. And the earliest date ranges say it's at least 700 more years old than what the carbon-14 dating says. So did the shroud influence early art? I'm going to show a couple of examples of that. And from the forehead to many other features, there are things that we can pull out, but I'm going to point out just some obvious things. One, the hair on this side shows up and not so much on this side. So you look, there are multiple examples of Jesus being painted like this. You look, what we know now is the amulet underneath the beard makes it look like he has a boxy neck. Look how boxy the neck is here. The nose has a distinct bend a little bit to that side, and we see that bend right here. The face is misshapen, and the cheekbone is swollen over here. Look at the misshapen face and the cheekbone here. So that is a 6th century Byzantine painting at St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at the base of Mount Sinai. Here's a 12th century painting, and you see the hair again. Over here and over here are different, more prominent over here. You see the bend in the nose, you see the misshapen cheeks, and you see something else that is in a lot of them, and it's a part in the beard. Why do we see a part in the beard? Well, we see a part in the beard there. So we see that in a lot of early paintings. Now we go to something that is modern, and it wasn't based on the shroud. But what this was based on, and we're looking at this painting right here called Prince of Peace, done by a little girl named Akiana. She did it when she was 8 years old. Well, Akiana, what did she use for her inspiration? When she was 4, she grew up in a home with an atheist mother and an agnostic dad. Religion wasn't talked about in their home. But when she was 4, she started having experiences where she would go to heaven. She would either do it in dreams or in visions. And she actually would see Jesus and talk to him. So she had this picture of him in her mind and ingrained in her mind. Well, at age 4, she started drawing. At age 6, she started painting. And at age 8, she painted this and called it Prince of Peace. She was self-taught, she says, taught by God how to paint. Well, we look at this, and then we look at the shroud. This right here is where an artist has just taken the shroud and put flesh tone on it and given him eyes instead of this. And then we look here at this painting. So we've had experts on the shroud compare the two, and experts have given 80 to 90% accuracy as far as what we see in the features. So if you look at the forehead, you see they are distinctly similar. The nose is pretty much exactly the same. The shape of the cheeks are pretty much the same. You get down here to the mouth, very, very similar. So it's amazing that this girl that had this experience, and I don't know how many of y'all saw Heaven is for Real, but this painting is what the little boy in Heaven is for Real looked at and said, yeah, that's Jesus, that's him. So this is one of my favorite parts, taking the scriptures and lining them up with what we see in the shroud. And the first thing we have to do is say, okay, was there a linen cloth that Jesus was laid in? In the book of Mark, we find that Joseph brought a linen cloth, took him down and wrapped him in the linen cloth and laid him in a tomb. So we have that mirror image here because he was laid down on this cloth as it was laid out, and then that cloth was folded over him, and then other linen wrappings were wrapped around him. And John, it says, so they took the body of Jesus, bound it in linen wrappings with spices, as the burial custom of the Jews. So we know that aloe and myrrhs were found in the shroud. So we do know from John that also this cloth was there after the resurrection. Stooping in and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. And so Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb and saw the linen wrappings lying there and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying within the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. So I've highlighted face cloth because that is believed to exist today as well. And it's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. And this is a picture of the Sudarium of Oviedo. And what you have here is blood, and we're going to find out that the markings of the blood are consistent with the markings on the shroud. And also, this was wrapped around the head, all the way around the head. And it is believed it was wrapped around the head while he was in an upright position on the cross. And this, scientists have found to be pleural edema, which is what builds up in the lungs when you die of asphyxiation, and that's what you die of when you're crucified. And it's presumed that that came out of both nostrils when they took him down off the cross with that face cloth on him. So what do they have in common? Both are the same herringbone weave that is very distinct throughout the shroud. The nose on the Sudarium and the shroud are the exact length. The blood flows on the Sudarium and the shroud match, and we're going to look at a short video here in a second that talks about that. The blood type in both cloths are type AB, high in bilirubin. Bilirubin would be high if you underwent extreme trauma. As we see, Jesus underwent extreme trauma. And so there's bilirubin in both of those. Type AB blood, only 3.2% of the world's population have type AB blood, but 18% of Jews do. And one interesting fact about type AB blood is the plasma from type AB blood can be donated to someone of any blood type. So if you have type O blood, you can receive plasma from type O blood or type AB blood plasma. So it's universally donorable, and the blood of Jesus is for everybody. So that's one amazing thing. Both cloths contain pollens in common from Israel. They have pollens that are from various places, the various places in which these traveled. The Siderium of Oviedo is in Oviedo, Spain. The Shroud is in Turin, Italy. They both contain pollens from various parts of the world, but they contain pollens that are only found in Israel, some of them. And there's over 120 points of comparison where both of them contain the same thing. We're going to take a look at a short video that talks about some of those comparisons.
I've invited to Turin Mark Guskin, an expert on the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. His evidence could push the date of the Turin Shroud back another 700 years to the 5th century. This is an identical copy of the Sudarium. Its purpose was to trap blood escaping from the corpse as it was taken away for burial. Guskin believes he's identified significant evidence linking the Sudarium to the Shroud of Turin.
Now, this blood comes from wounds that were made by some kind of sharp object piercing the skin in this area of the nape of the neck. Okay, perfectly compatible with what has been called since then a crown of thorns. Okay, now if we look at this, we have exactly the same stains in the same area on the Shroud of Turin. Now the actual shape of the stains, if you do an overlay of the two, well, the actual shape, you know, the way the blood flowed coincides on both cloths.
So what you're saying is not only the blood types that are the same, the actual patterns of the blood on both cloths can be matched.
That's right. That's exactly so.
Amazing.
Which has led more than one qualified forensic doctor to say that the only conclusion you can make from that is that both cloths were used on the same body. In other words, it's too much for a simple coincidence.
But so let me understand, what you're saying is that the fact that we know exactly what happened to the Sudarium in its history has huge implications for the Shroud, because obviously they both covered the same man.
That's right. And the only place that they could have coincided in time was in Jerusalem, sometime before the 4th or the 5th century. You know, there's no two ways about that. They couldn't have coincided at any given time after that.
Because we know what happens to
know
the
exactly where the Sudarium was all the time.
So we know that the Sudarium has a continuous verifiable history dating back to at least 614 AD, and some say before that, when the Christians fleeing Palestine ahead of Persian invasion took the oak chest containing it. And in 840, the king built a small holy chamber that held relics that they valued to protect them, and the Sudarium was put in there. And later the Cathedral of San Salvador Oviedo was built around that holy chamber, and that's where we find that today. So there is the oak chest containing the Sudarium of Oviedo within that holy chamber. So Jesus wore a crown of thorns. And Mark says they dressed him up in purple, and after twisting the crown of thorns, they put it on him and began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They kept beating him on the head with a reed, spitting on him and kneeling and bowing before him. The crown of thorns is not like what you see typically in the movies, the little ring. Study of the shroud shows that there are penetration points all over the top of the head, all the way down to the nape of the neck. And so it probably looked much more like this. And it says they beat him with a reed. And I just was trying to picture that, and I always pictured a flimsy, heavy piece of grass or something like that. But I did some research, and it's not like that. It's more like a bamboo shoot. It's hard. So when they beat him on the head, it would have pressed that down in and caused puncture wounds in the head in which the blood issued out of. We know that his face was beaten and his beard was pulled out. In Isaiah, it says, "I gave my back to those who strike me and my cheeks to those who pluck out my beard." So the missing part of the beard right here, the part in the beard, likely where part of his beard was plucked out. And in Luke, now the men who were holding Jesus in custody, they were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophecy, who is the one who hit you?" Look at the swelling on his cheek there compared to the other. His nose also, you can see that it's probably swollen up there. All of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record that Jesus was scourged. Jesus had 120 scourge marks, as best as could be counted from this. It goes all across his back, onto his buttocks, down the back of his legs. It continues even on the front of him. You can see them there. You can see them on the front of his legs as well. Well, this is the typical Roman flagrum right here. A Roman flagrum, history tells us, typically had 3 to 4 leather straps, and it had lead balls in the shape of dumbbells on them. And so when they used that, they would whip from behind typically. And the Jews had a rule of 40 save 1 if someone was being scourged, which is 39 lashes. But the Romans didn't have that same thing. They would have a centurion watching over, and they would just make them stop at the point in which they said, okay, if we continue, we may kill him by the scourging, which wasn't the purpose of the scourging. So it is likely that Jesus was whipped 40 times with a flagrum that had the 3 leather straps. And this is what his back looked like. It's hard to look at. You see on his shoulder, probably from carrying the wooden cross, Isaiah, the chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. People, from the top of his head down to his feet where the spike went through. There wasn't a place on his body that wasn't covered. If you need healing anywhere, it's paid for. By his stripes we are healed. So Jesus had a side wound, we know that. To make sure he was dead, the soldier pierced his side, and John, it accounts that. And immediately blood and water came out. And we've already talked about the forensic pathologist report, how it shows that that is blood and water, in fact. And it is different from the other blood flows in that he was already dead when this blood flow occurred. He knew it was coming. He knew he was about to get this, but he did it for us. In Luke, he withdrew from them about a stone's throw away, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but your will be done." How great a love that he did this for us. So science has tried to explain how this image got there. They don't know for sure. But does anybody know what this is? This is a wooden wall. There's the image of a man and possibly a wooden cart or something. It was, yes.
Hiroshima.
Exactly. So when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, this image was left there. The man was vaporized, but the image was left there. The intense burst of light is thought to have caused this image. And we know how powerful that burst was. So the National Agency for New Technologies, Energy, Sustainable Economic Development spent 5 years studying the shroud, and they determined that the image was created by a radiant burst of light at the point of resurrection. And they also determined that with today's technology, there's no way they can reproduce the intensity of the light that would have been required to create this image. It cannot be duplicated. A particle physicist by the name of Isabel Pitzik goes as far as saying that she believes the light that caused the image on the shroud was so powerful that she likens it to the creation Big Bang event. So we're going to let her tell you in her words what she thinks it was like.
When you look at the image of the shroud, the 2 bodies next to each other, you feel that it's a flat image. But if you create, for instance, a 3-dimensional object, as I did, the real body, then you realize that there is a strange dividing element, an interface, from which the image is projected up and the image is projected down. the muscles of the body are absolutely not crushed against the stone of the tomb. They are perfect. It means that the body is hovering between the two sides of the shroud. What does that mean? That there is absolutely no gravity. Other strange things you discover, that the image is absolutely undistorted. Now, if you imagine that the cloth was wrinkled, tied, wrapped around the body, and all of a sudden you see a perfect image, which is impossible unless the shroud was made absolutely taut, rigidly taut. Everybody thinks that the tomb signifies death. Not at all, the exact opposite. The shroud and the tomb signifies an unbelievable beginning, because in the depth of the collapsed event horizon, there is something which science knows as singularity. This is exactly what started the universe in the Big Bang. We have nothing less in the tomb of Christ than the beginning of a new universe.
Amen. So, we don't know for sure, but what we do know is that science believes that it was an incredible burst of light, so powerful that one particle physicist says it was like the Big Bang. What a powerful thing that raised Jesus from the dead. So what raised Jesus from the dead? That same power lives in us. What power do we have in us? In Romans, but if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, He who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through His Spirit who dwells in you. And Scripture on the light. Jesus is the light of the world. In 1 Peter, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light. And one of my favorites in John, then Jesus again spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I want to read something that Akiana, the 8-year-old girl, said. Akiana was once found by her parents staring off into space with a smile on her face. Asked what she was doing, she simply answered, I was with God again, and He told me to pray continually. He showed me where He lived. I was climbing transparent stairs. Underneath I saw gushing waterfalls, and as I approached Him, His body was pure and intense light. He is the light of the world. So people, we who already believe don't need the shroud to believe. But what did Jesus say? Blessed are those who believe who don't see. And that was after Thomas said, I'll believe if I put my hand in the nail imprints and my hand in the wound in His side. But why has this survived for 2,000 years? It survived 2 fires. I believe it has survived because God desires that not one should perish. And those who don't believe, there are some who believe science explains everything. Well, science can't explain this. This was created 2,000 years ago, and the best science still doesn't know how it got there. So this might start a journey for some people that leads them to Christ. So that's why I believe it exists today. Thank you very much.